So let's talk about data collection and data collection practice. So when you are measuring behavior, you first want to choose a measurement system. The most typical measurements that we would use are frequency, rate, duration, and interval. Sometimes we'll use latency, topography, force, or locus. So we want to cover all of these today. All right, so it doesn't matter what you're measuring. If you are measuring the acquisition of a skill, number of sight words said correctly, number of spelling words written correctly, number of words per minute read, number of math problems completed correctly, you can use what we call frequency or event recording. Frequency and event recording refer to the number of items completed correctly. All right, so when we're talking about frequency or event recording, tally marks or counting, all of these are referring to the measurement of discrete behaviors, things that have a clear beginning and an end. So if we're talking about sight words, sight word read correctly, spelling words spelled correctly, and so that there's either a correct or an incorrect for each one, right? And so you can write down the number of times it occurred. You can also, if you know the opportunities that they had to perform the skill. So it's a trial-based skill. You give them a task direction, they perform it. You can actually convert to a percentage. How many they got correct out of how many opportunities. I gave them 10 problems, they got all 10 correct. I gave them 10 spelling words, they got 8 correct. You can convert to a percentage, 80%, 100%, and so forth. There's also what we call free operant behaviors. We're just observing to see how many times this learner stands up from their seat. That also can be measured by a frequency, but it's not a trial. There's not an SD or task direction given during class to get out of the seat. The learner just gets up on their own. It's a free operant. They're freely choosing to get up. And so you can also measure. You just would not convert this into a percentage because there's not a specific task direction for each one of these. All right? So when we're talking about discrete skills, measuring discrete skills, whether it's learning a new behavior or which would be as part of a trial, given a task direction and the learner completes it or not, or just performing, you're observing a learner perform behaviors that you've identified in the classroom, getting out of the seat, throwing something, saying a curse word. Those are all behaviors that you could also measure by frequency or count. A tally mark. So if you're using a tally mark, if you're counting the number of responses, it's the frequency of the behavior. These are all under the term event recording. All of these go together. Frequency, count, tally mark are all part of what we call event recording. And sometimes your event recording, depending on what it is, if it is acquisition of skill, the learner responding to a task direction, you will also know how many opportunities they had. So not only would you have the frequency or the count, you would also be able to have a percentage correct. All right? The other thing that you can evaluate from frequency or count is rate. And that is if you also have the time component. So if you want to talk about the rate at which a behavior occurs, you can determine that by the frequency, which is the count, the tally marks of the behavior occurring, divided by the period of time in which you measure that behavior. All right, and so very often you will convert a specific behavior that's observed in a time period into a rate. Let's say one day you observe the learner for 10 minutes, another day you observe the learner for 30 minutes. If you convert it into rate, you can compare the amount of behavior that happened in 10 minutes as compared to the amount of behavior that occurred in 30 minutes. You have a comparison for the two. Classroom behaviors that you might consider to do with rate is 6 behaviors out of seat in 30 minutes, 8 behaviors out of seat in 40 minutes, 10 behaviors out of seat also in 40 minutes. Looking at these, if you would actually convert to rate, which of these do you think occurred at the highest rate? So if you look at this, 6 out of seat every 30 minutes. So one behavior occurred approximately every 5 minutes, on average of every 5 minutes. 8 out of seat events in 40 minutes, also once out of approximately every 5 minutes. These are essentially the same. But let's say another learner you observed, or maybe in another environment you observed 10 out of seat events in 40 minutes. This is 1 every 4 minutes. So this is occurring at a higher rate. This would be a behavior that you would want to intervene on first. Can you think of any academic fluency examples? So, for example, have you ever measured a learner's reading fluency? How many words read correctly per minute? That's academic fluency. It's the frequency or count of the number of words in a specific period of time, typically 1 minute. Also think about minute math problems. How many math problems can the learner complete correctly in 1 minute? Again, it's the count correct in a period of time. So it's rate. Anytime you do words per minute, miles per hour, you're looking at rate. Here is an example of an event recording data sheet for several days. So the teacher would actually define the target behavior in observable, measurable terms, indicate the date, tally box. You're recording a tally mark for every time you observe the behavior. This is an event recording. You're looking at frequency. You're tallying the mark, and then you end up with the total number of behaviors for each session at the end. Then you can compare across days. If you also want to convert this into rate, you also need to have not just the date, but the duration of the session, when the session began, when the session ended. So you would end up with your target behaviors and the duration of time as well. All right, we're going to go through this in class because it's kind of fun that we will have an opportunity to measure frequency or rate. Let's take a quick look at this video. So for example, look at this, and I have written a definition of hit as within arm's length distance of another person, hand raised up, then quickly and forcefully directed down toward another person, coming into contact or near contact within 1 foot of another person is the definition that I devised for hit for this particular video. So watch this and see how many times, how many tally marks would you put on your data sheet for hit.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
Nice to meet you.
Pleased to meet you, Joe.
Wow.
What's your name?
Alejandra.
Alejandra, pleased to meet
Wow. So nice to have you.
you. Mum and Dad are at work, is that right?
Yes, I'm Jojo.
Yeah. And who's this little one here?
Farley.
Hi, Farley. Pleased to meet you. I'm Jojo. Hi, how are you? Good. Pleased to meet you. And who else we have?
Pierce and
Pierce.
Kyle.
Alejandro took me upstairs to see Carl, but before I could even say hello, he kicked off and he started to punch his sister.
Stop! Kyle! Kyle! That is not nice.
Kyle hit me and I don't like it.
Stop. You're not listening. It's not funny. Stop! Stop! Go in your room.
Before Alejandro could even get control of Carl, he ran down to the side of the house.
Why are you running away? Come here! It's not okay what you did, okay? Go say sorry to your sister. Over there. Hey, guys!
I couldn't even say hello to him before Farley come along to get a few more licks in.
Get Farley. Kyle! Stop! Stop hitting her!
All right, so I will pause it there. And another example of event recording, as we already talked about, is measuring some type of academic fluency. So for example, reading fluency, words per minute. So when you're doing the number of count or frequency per time, that will end up being a measurement of rate. And so I do have materials that I will bring into class to measure dibbles, reading samples. So it would be reading 1 minute's worth of dibbles. And we'll practice measuring rate that way as well. One more example of measuring rate, starting with an event recording and then converting to rate. So just remember, for rate, with event recording, you need not just the frequency or count of behavior, you also need to have the duration of time. Think about what types of measurements event recording would be used for both frequency and for rate. Also be aware of your pros and cons. Now let's talk about duration. Duration refers to how long the behavior occurred. For example, how long did the meltdown occur? You have to have that meltdown operationally defined so that you know when it actually started and when it stopped. How long did the student stay in their seat? How long did it take the learner to complete their worksheet? These are all examples that you would use duration to measure. One type of measurement is duration per occurrence. So especially if you're looking at a problem behavior in class, or an on-task or off-task behavior, you would have your behavioral definition. Every time the learner began to engage in the behavior, you would start measuring. When the learner stopped and went on to something else, you'd stop your measurement. So not only would you have the duration per each occurrence over the class period, you would also have the number of times the behavior occurred. So you would have a measurement of the frequency of the behavior and of the duration per occurrence. You could also calculate the average length of occurrence from that, looking at all of your occurrences during that time period. And then you could also look at the total session in class and develop the percentage of the class period in which that behavior occurred. There's lots of information you can get from duration per occurrence measurement systems. Here's an example of duration recording in class. Start time here, end time here. So for example, behavior started at 9:01 and ended at 9:01:50. The duration was 50 seconds. And then I would do that throughout the class. And I have my different durations here. 50 seconds, 90 seconds, 50 seconds, 60 seconds, and 50 seconds. So then, from that information, the start time was 9 o'clock. The end time of my observations was 9:20. I could say within that 20-minute period, the total time that I observed was 20 minutes, 1,200 seconds, right? And then if I'm measuring off-task behaviors, I could look at the total time off task, could add all of these up, and from there determine the percentage of time off task. The total time off task divided by the total time times 100 would give me a percentage. And then I can from there develop my average or mean duration of behavior. Add all these up together and divide by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I would say that the behaviors occurred at 4 times during that period, totaling this many seconds. I could have the total time off task, the percentage of time that it occurred during that period, and then the average mean behavior. So these are things that we will calculate as well. It gives you a lot of valuable information. And then this is the behavior that we will practice measuring in class. And so the actual definition of the target behavior for this little boy in the back, his name is Dan. We are going to be looking at on-task behavior, the duration of on-task behavior. So whenever you actually see him seated upright, body facing forward, book open and held in front of body, eyes on book or teacher, we're going to start counting, and then when he starts engaging in any other behavior, not seated upright, body turned in a different direction, book no longer open, eyes not on the book or the teacher but somewhere else, the behavior count or the duration will stop being counted. So let's just take a look at this, and we will actively measure this in class.
All right, let's review our American history. Where did the Boston Tea Party occur?
This is our boy back here.
Boston, Massachusetts.
Very good, very good.
Oh, you can start measuring. Start measuring. Oh, stop.
Let's see. Who were the Axis powers in World War II?
The Nazis and the Italians.
And?
Yeah, the Americans.
No, they were not part of the Axis.
The Japanese.
Hey, Dan, pay attention. Okay, this is going to be on the test.
Okay, start measuring. Oh, stop measuring.
Very good. Who were the Allies?
Start measuring.
England and France.
Good.
Can't count right now because you can't see it.
Okay.
Oh, look. Oh,
Any
he's
more?
not doing it anymore anyway.
A few more. Okay, we did French.
Oh,
Yes.
Burmese.
No. Think north of us. Hey, Dan! Stop that! Don't be disruptive. Canadians, yes, very good. All right, and what about Vietnam?
There was the Americans and the Japanese.
Hey, Dan, sit down! I'm tired of this disruptive behavior.
All right, so you can see this child is off task more than on task. So trying to measure on task behavior will be very brief. We could flip it around and instead measure off task behavior as well. All right, so we'll practice on this in class. I also have a lot to say. I want to get your thoughts as well about things that the adult, the teacher, could do differently, thinking about our information on antecedent-based strategies and also on reinforcement-based strategies that could help Dan be more successful in this environment. So for duration recording, think about the types of measurements duration recording would be used for. They need to be some length of time. And the problem with duration recording, the biggest issue with it, is it takes a dedicated observer. You have to spend your focus completely on measuring that behavior, so you're ready to turn your timer off and on when the behavior first, with the very onset of the behavior and with the offset of that behavior. So because it can be difficult to measure consistently, you might consider what's called momentary time sampling, and we will practice that as well. So momentary time sampling is an example of an interval recording or a time sampling measurement. Basically what you do is you set the interval that you are going to observe, the duration of the session that you're going to observe into intervals. That's why it's an interval recording. And you will, with momentary time sampling, observe at the end of each of those intervals. It's considered a non-continuous recording method. It gives you an estimate of behavior, especially when you have a small interval. So if you only observe the behavior every 5 minutes, it's not going to be very effective. With a momentary time sampling, if you observe every 20 seconds, every 30 seconds, or at least every minute, not going longer than a minute, for most on-task behaviors, that will give you a decent estimate of the behavior. If you start going longer than a minute, you very likely will no longer have a good estimate of the behavior. It does give you a nice estimate of the duration of behavior. It can give you some information on frequency or count, but it's less accurate. So what you would do to set up a momentary time sampling measurement system is you would subdivide your observation into intervals of time. So this is a 1-minute session that's been subdivided into 5-second intervals. And then essentially you will score at the end of each interval, at that moment that the interval ends, whether or not the behavior occurred. So start your timer going at the end of 5 seconds. I was saying seconds. This looks like it's also minutes that runs across an hour. So you could do this seconds or minutes. 5 minutes, again, I think it's too long. But if it's occurring at the end of the interval, then you would record an X. If it's occurring at the end of the next interval, you record an X. If it's not occurring at the end of the next interval, you would record a 0. And so you can go to the very end and say the number of intervals at which the behavior was occurring at the end, get your total, and then you can compare from day to day to day. So day 1, 8 out of 12 intervals, the behavior was occurring at the end. So an estimate of 60% of class time, the learner was talking to peers. Another day you observed, you had 7 of 12 intervals, 58%. Day 3, 9 out of 12, 75%. Then you can develop an intervention plan, continue to use momentary time sampling to check, and get an idea, is your intervention plan working or not? So momentary time sampling can save you as a teacher a lot of time. You can implement a momentary time sampling system while you're actually instructing. You can have a little timer on your phone in your pocket and a vibration to signal every time that you should be observing at that moment. Then you can either have a little sticky pad that you write your note on the interval, or you could have an app on your phone that will allow you to toggle off or on if you observe the behavior. There's some nice apps out there that will allow you to do scoring directly on the app. So we will practice momentary time sampling as well. Here's a built-in momentary time sampling for this video, so we'll watch this one. This is another iteration of Disruptive Dan that we will use for momentary time sampling in class as well. But let's take a look at this one so you can get an idea. So essentially, if the man is juggling the ball with feet, knees, or thighs at the moment that you're supposed to measure, you would count it as an occurrence. If the man is using his head, arms, shoulders, or back to touch the ball at that moment, it would not be an occurrence of behavior. So you're looking at the man juggling the ball with feet, knees, or thighs. Let's watch and see. And the beep will signal the end of the interval. That's the moment at which you actually record the behavior. All right. To know at that interval. That's another no. Are you getting the hang of it? You're just measuring what's going on when the beep happens. So we will also work on this in class. Just gives you an idea of momentary time sampling. It can be a more efficient way of measuring behavior. The downfall or the reason you wouldn't want to use it if you need to have a very exact count, because it only estimates the duration or the occurrences of behavior. All right, let's talk about a few other methods for data collection. You can analyze written records, which would include your records. Your written records could be indirect assessments. Thinking about your functional behavior assessments when you gather information from not direct observation, when you're getting information from parents or teachers or sometimes even the learner themselves, but not directly what they're doing. It's their own recollection of what they did and why. You could also use descriptive assessments where you are sitting in the back of the classroom and writing notes on the antecedents and the behavior and the consequences that you observe. So you can analyze that. One method of analyzing your data. You could observe tangible products, permanent products, scoring, spelling tests, math tests, using a rubric to score a writing sample. Then you can have direct observation of target behavior, which would include some of the measurement systems we discussed today. Event recording, which is looking at the frequency or count of the behavior, looking at tally marks. Interval recording, time sampling recording is when you're dividing your observation period into intervals of seconds or minutes, and you are observing at the end of each interval for a momentary time sampling example. Duration recording, when you have your measurement, your definition of behavior, you begin recording when the behavior initially begins to occur, the onset of the behavior. You stop your timer when the behavior stops occurring at the offset of the behavior, and you gather information on the duration of each instance of that behavior. And then there's latency recording, which we have not really addressed. Latency is as a form of duration. It's the amount of time between the teacher's task direction and the learner's response. So this is really important when a learner takes a long time to respond, either because they're not on task or because they just might have slow processing or motor planning skills. So you would measure the teacher say, what word and how long does it take the learner to give you the response? Or the teacher might say, write your name. How long does it take for the learner to begin writing the first letter of their name? That's the latency between the task direction and the initiation of the response. So as you think about that, I want you to think about what would you use to measure information from indirect assessments, permanent products, and each of these types of direct observation measurement systems. The last thing I want to talk about is reliability, and reliability is repeatability. Essentially, you're looking at, will another observer report the same score as you do? So think about, and we'll discuss this in class, what is necessary to have high reliability? First of all, you need to have a really clear-cut, observable, measurable definition. Both of you need to have confidence that you're measuring the same thing. You also have to have clear-cut measurement systems in place that each observer knows exactly how they're observing and measuring behavior. And so here's an example from actually a research study that I ran. So I collected data for each of these squares here, and then I had another person come in and collect data. This is duration data with the open square. And so every time they came in every 5 days or so, every time they measured, I plotted it on my graph as well so I could show how close they were to me. So here they were a little bit off, but very close to what I scored. Here we scored identical measures. Same thing, a little bit off and some identical. And so this is ideally what you want to see. If their score was much higher or much lower than mine, it would not indicate reliability. It would not indicate that we were observing the same behavior. We would need to go back and look at our definition and our measurement system. Typically 80% of a correlation is considered reliable. You want to have have the same score within 80%. All right, so reliability refers to repeatability. It's when you're measuring behavior, You're looking at inter-rater reliability, two people, two raters getting the same score, or inter-observer agreement, two observers having an agreement on that they're observing the same score. And again, 0.8 or 80% and higher is considered acceptable. There are 3 different ways to measure it, with event recording, duration recording, and with momentary time sampling. So we will actually practice this in class as well, just so you have some practice with this. This becomes really important if you're in a classroom setting and you are one of multiple teachers, or you and your educational assistants are collecting data, the same data on your learners. You want to have confidence that you're measuring the same thing. At some points you will want to measure and score the same behaviors and determine how reliable your scores are. And this is when you would use one of these different calculations to determine your reliability. Here's another example that I'm just going to briefly go over before we end our lesson today, and we'll discuss this more in class. But here's an example of interval recordings. So the 1st through the 10th recordings, looking at what observer 1 and observer 2 scored. And you can see you're looking for each interval where they scored the same behaviors. So here there's a disagreement between observer 1 and 2. Here they agree. Interval 3 they agree, 4 they agree, 5 they don't agree, 6 they agree, 7 and 8 they don't agree, 9 they agree, 10 they don't agree. So how many intervals did they actually agree that they saw behavior or did not see behavior? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 intervals out of 10. They have 50% reliability. Would that be considered a decent reliability score? Yes or no? All right, we'll talk more about reliability in class as well as other measurements.